Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Carleton University. My name is Teddy Sami. I'm the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, also known as NIPSIA, at Carleton University. We're delighted to partner with Together Ensemble, Ottawa, and the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals, CIDIP, for today's conference on contributions, challenges, solutions, reimagining Canada's role in the SDGs. As I was thinking about what I would say very briefly this morning, of course, I couldn't help thinking about what's going on outside and what we've seen in the last couple of days. I've lived in the National Capital Region for 25 years, and I don't recall ever having seen an advisory about health hazards related to wildfire smoke. And I think it's a reminder of the impact that climate change is having and is going to continue to have on people's lives. And you can feel it even if it's not close to us, but there are hundreds of wildfires burning across the country as we speak. And that's a big challenge. It's one of the many, I think, challenges that we have to face, that we will have to face in the coming years. So I think this conference could not be more appropriate because of where we are, at the halfway point for the SDGs, 2023 is supposed to be where we take stock of what we've done in the last 7.5 years or so. I'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about that later on in my presentation, but to kick things off, I will pass the floor to our president, who I will introduce for a few seconds. So we're obviously delighted that he's able to take time out of his busy schedule to join us this morning. Dr. Benoit-Antoine Bacon is the president and vice chancellor of Carleton University. He started his 5-year mandate as president of Carleton on July 1st, 2018, and was recently reviewed for a second 5-year term. He joined Carleton from Queen's University, where he served as provost and vice principal academic. He previously served as provost and vice president academic affairs at Concordia University in his hometown of Montreal, where he was recognized with an award as Concordia University Sustainability Champion. Dr. Bacon holds a PhD in neuropsychology from the University of Montreal, after which he undertook an NSERC-funded postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. His research in the field of cognitive neuroscience focuses on the links between brain activity and perception in the visual and auditory systems, as well as on multisensory integration. So thank you very much, President, for being here. So I'll pass you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Teddy. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. J'espère que ça va bien. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Real pleasure, real pleasure. I wish I could say on this beautiful day. But Teddy, thank you for acknowledging what's happening outside. It truly is concerning, and it does make the discussion that we're having today even more relevant. Today's meeting, I love how you've titled the event, Contributions, Challenges, Solutions, the whole spectrum, reimagining Canada's role in the SDGs. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Carleton is situated is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And of course, this month, June, is Indigenous History Month. And as always, we're advancing here on campus the 41 calls to actions of our Kinamagwin strategy. And if I may, on a day like this, with the wildfires and the smoke, we have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples in the realm of sustainability. And that's something that we should consider very carefully as we move forward. So the day ahead convenes political and corporate, nonprofit, academic, social innovation, and an array of other leaders and experts who are bringing their knowledge and expertise to bear on our continued efforts to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And at Carleton, we take the achievement of these 17 time-bound, and that's an important component of it, time-bound goals very seriously. We know that our contributions matter today in what we do on campus, and we've been doing a lot, still a lot to do, but perhaps especially tomorrow with our graduates going out into the world towards building the future that we all hope for, towards improving the way that we live on our only planet. We've had a long-standing commitment to sustainable operations here on campus, going back to the 90s, really, starting probably with recycling and energy-efficient design for our buildings. And since that time, we've made a lot of progress. We now have a full energy master plan that has delivered about 35% reduction in our carbon emission, on our way to 50% the reduction by 2030, and eventually, hopefully before 2050, towards carbon neutrality. All our buildings and major renovations are certified towards a sustainability performance, and we're very proud of that. We've achieved zero waste in our food court and residence dining. In terms of teaching, we've seen an increased focus on sustainability across all programs, both on the tech side and on the policy side, and that's been really great to see. And we're leaders in research and sustainability. Just last week, I had the pleasure to be at the opening of the KABER facility, the Center for Advanced Building Envelope Research, retrofitting, in essence, over 16 million residential houses and 500,000 commercial buildings across the country are in need of retrofit, and they contribute about 25% of greenhouse gas emission. We're leaders in energy conservation. So I take great pride that we've reaffirmed our commitment to sustainability in our current strategic integrated plan. We say we strive for sustainability, and that's intentional to say we strive. I don't think you can ever solve an issue like sustainability. It's ongoing work. It's something that you always seek to improve and seek to attain. Here at Carleton, we've received the gold rating from ASHE that certifies university campuses, one of the few campuses in this country with the gold rating. We're ranked first in Ontario and second in Canada by the prestigious international UI Green Metrics, but that doesn't mean we're resting on our laurels. There's still a lot to do. And so we're truly delighted in that context to host you here today, to share the knowledge of our great professors, our students, and to learn together. And in a few minutes, we'll be welcoming Anita van den Beld, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development. Thank you for being here. An MP, of course, very close to our riding here, and a friend of Carleton, I understand, with several ties. Real pleasure to have you here. Later in the day, we'll be welcoming Minister Katrina Gould and MPs, along with an impressive list of experts. Thank you all for your important contributions to the day. In closing, let me take a moment to thank Dr. Teddy Sami, who you just heard from, the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, NIPSIA, flagship unit for this university. Mr. David Comerford, the president of KDIP, David that I just met coming in. Where's David? There he is, standing in the back. And we had a chance to meet, as well as their teams, for all the work that you've put into bringing us together today. It's much appreciated, and thank you for inviting me. I wish you all very successful deliberation, and I look forward to hearing the results of your hard work. And with that, I will turn it over to our hosts. David, I think you're first. Merci beaucoup, everybody. Thank you very much. Enjoy the day.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for showing up on this absolutely wonderful day. I hope you're all in good health. I know I've been coughing for the past couple of days, and I do gather that it's probably from the wonderful air that we have out there today. And as you know, we have approximately 400 fires burning across the country right now, many of them out of control. And when you think of that in terms of the SDGs, that affects our health, it affects the economy, it affects people's livelihoods, drives people into poverty, it drives people into health conditions that they no longer are able to afford. And we're seeing this worldwide, as you know. So this particular conference today is very important in terms of tracking our progress towards the SDGs. Now, as you've heard, I'm the president of CADIP. I'm also the vice president of Canadian Leaders in International Consulting. And we do a lot of work worldwide, especially in the Middle East. One of the countries we work in, Iraq, or two of the countries, Iraq and Jordan, are actually two of the countries considered to be most affected by global warming and climate change. So, we're all very concerned about what is happening in the world today, and we're very concerned about how we're going to be moving over the next decade in terms of achieving the SDGs. Now, CADIP itself, many of you may already be members, some of you aren't. CADIP, the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals, essentially is a membership organization of development professionals and practitioners, includes individuals and corporations. We're there to advocate for the interests of the international development community, to provide a platform for sharing and learning. And so I encourage all of you, if you're not a member, to become a member and to check us out on the web. You can find us at www.cadip-réseau des professionnels de développement international, the French acronym, and you can find us, find out more about us. Okay? We're pleased to be co-hosting this with Carleton University today. So I thank un grand merci à Antoine et à toute l'université pour nous avoir accueillis, pour avoir fourni cette salle de rencontre et pour avoir aidé à organiser cet événement. Now, today, as many of you know, perhaps all of you know, this year marks the halfway point in the Agenda 2030, okay, the UN's Agenda 2030 for the achievement of the 17 SDGs. Okay? Unfortunately, no country has met completely the SDGs. Canada, does anybody know what position Canada is in? 29th. So we're apparently about 29th in terms of what we've accomplished on the SDGs. Okay? The event today is one of 6 events happening across the country in universities from Halifax to Vancouver. It's in the context of tracking the progress that we've made towards the SDGs. And it's also part of the Together Ensemble Canada's National Conference. Now, by the National Conference, we don't mean this one event. We're talking about 6 events across the country, plus tomorrow and Friday will be additional events happening across the country with various organizations. And Volupti, you can correct me if I'm not exactly accurate on that, but we'll talk about that probably later. The Together Ensemble 2023 conference theme will focus on how we can accelerate Canada's SDGs progress and what needs to be done differently to achieve them. Together Ensemble is taking place today, tomorrow, and Friday. The conference will be hosted in person and online on days 2 and 3, and even today, in sites across Canada, as I mentioned earlier. Okay. Today, the discussion outputs, of all the breakout sessions. So we have 4 breakout sessions, and hopefully you will be able to divide yourselves equally as best possible amongst those sessions. Okay? Plus the plenary discussions will be combined into the overall Together Ensemble report being prepared by the University of Waterloo. Okay? It will result in a specific set of recommendations from the international development experts here in this room and from the other events happening across the country, with inputs from those who were not able to attend, and will be prepared and collaboratively by CADIP and NIPSIA for the members of the Parliamentary Committee on international affairs. Okay? So CADIP is delighted to be part of this event, which is being hosted here at NIPSIA, okay? and in convening the experts on the SDGs. The conference represents an all-of-society approach to addressing Canada's toughest sustainable development challenges, bringing together the private sector, academia, government, civil society. Okay? The University of Waterloo, okay, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the lead organizer for all of these events, okay, with funding from the Government of Canada's Sustainable Development Goals Funding Program, okay, and other partners. So before we begin this, again, I'd like to thank Antoine and Teddy and John Beal, the manager of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Canada, for including CADIP in the development, in the Together Ensemble National Conference. Okay? Also like to acknowledge the presence of Matthew Bishop, a renowned journalist, author, innovator, and creator of the 17-room concept. So I'm not sure if you all know the 17-room concept, but he's the founder of, or the creator of that 17-room concept, which you'll probably be hearing about during the day. Okay? And he's come to us from across the pond. Now, of course, you know, those of you who are not Newfoundlanders, like myself, probably don't realize that the pond is not Lake Ontario, right? So it's actually the Atlantic Ocean. So he's all the way from London. Okay? And we've mentioned that we have a number of eminent, prominent guests coming, including the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development, Anita Vanderbilt, and we have the Minister, Minister Katrina Gould, who's going to be arriving later this morning or early this afternoon, and she'll be hosting a couple of our events. Okay. Finally, or maybe not finally, but I'd also like to acknowledge the role of Volupti Corliss, who is here in the room. She is the mastermind behind this event, and so I'd like to just give her a big thanks for putting all this together and getting all of you out here today. Okay? So again, thank you all, and I look forward to having a very engaging event during the day. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Abbas Sumar. I'm the outgoing chair of the Canadian Association for International Development Professionals, and I'm very excited to be here today for a number of reasons with so many familiar faces and so many new ones. I'm also an alumni of Carleton, so this brings me great pleasure to see both organizations come together. But more so, excited to introduce our Parliamentary Secretary, Anita Vandenbelt. So I'd like to invite you up to the stage now, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Bienvenue tout le monde. It is really wonderful to be able to be here today on this traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And it's particularly special because this is, of course, what we would call a friendly audience. You are all very committed to the SDGs. You're all passionate about international development. And I think that this is a time where we really do need to come together in the way that you are across the country today, because we are facing challenging times. You literally have to look out the window. And it's never been more evident. I think when I was doing the kind of work that you do before politics, and I was working with UNDP and other organizations around the world, we were talking about the Millennium Development Goals. And it was actually a time of tremendous optimism. And I think we all really thought that the trajectory was just going to keep going this way. And what we're seeing now, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate, as literally visibly we can see what is happening today, whether it's because of conflict, which is happening, all around the world, whether it's visible or invisible, I think we are seeing that it's not self-evident that we are going to be moving forwards toward the SDGs. In some ways, we're trying to prevent things from going backwards. And so it's a little bit of a different time, but I think a time when governments are even more committed. And you know that the Canadian government is 100% committed, and it's a time where we really need to come together, all of us, in order to meet these challenges so that we can get back to that sense of optimism and that sense that we really are making progress and that it is doable. I think one of the dangers right now is the sense of fatigue, the sense of there's so much wrong out there, why bother trying? And I'm here to say, no, we need to look to inspiration, we need to look to hope, and we need to come together and remind each other that this is for humanity. And that's why I'm here today, and I know that's why all of you are also here today. The pandemic, climate change, and the financial, food, and energy crises have undermined the hard-won progress and set back the achievements of the SDGs. It is clear that the status quo, just maintaining the status quo, is not enough. It doesn't work. We need a transformation to alter the trajectory towards a more peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, just, and sustainable world for current and future generations. Now that we're at the halfway point of the 2030 Agenda, as was mentioned, it's more important than ever that we come together to accelerate progress and ensure that no one is left behind. We need innovative solutions and all hands on deck to make the SDGs a reality for all. As you know, Global Affairs Canada leads Canada's international implementation. But, of course, we work very closely with Employment and Social Development Canada. And as was mentioned, you're going to hear later on from Minister Karina Gold, who I believe is coming later this morning, to talk about Canada's progress toward the SDGs. Canada's international implementation of the SDGs is guided by our feminist foreign policy. This includes the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which I think most of all of us know as FIAP. Our overarching goal is to reach the poorest and those in vulnerable situations so that no one is left behind. And often when people who are not involved in international development or some of my constituents ask, what is FIAP? Why do you make everything feminist? I explain to them that in every single development project out there that has failed, there is a group of women somewhere in a village who are scratching their heads and saying, if only they'd asked us first, we could have told them. FIAP is about asking them first. Plain and simple, that's what it's about. And it is about intersectionality. We need to make sure that intersectionality is centered in everything that we do. We need to center gender-responsive approaches. And we need to center the advancement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls across all of the action areas of the policy. In this way, we can increase the effectiveness and impact of our efforts in developing countries. Par exemple, notre programme Voix et leadership des femmes. Nous répondons aux besoins des organisations de défense des droits des femmes à l'échelle locale dans des pays du monde entier. Nous contribuons à renforcer les capacités et l'efficacité de ces organisations. Et nous contribuons à accroître leur viabilité. Depuis 2017, plus de 150 millions de dollars ont été investis dans le cadre de ce programme en Afrique, en Asie et en Amérique latine et dans les Caraïbes, touchant ainsi 500 organisations de défense des droits des femmes. That's 500 organizations that defend the rights of women and girls that have benefited from our Women's Voice and Leadership Program over the years. En avril de cette année, le ministre Sajjan a annoncé un investissement supplémentaire de 195 millions de dollars sur 5 ans au titre de ce programme. So we will be continuing the funding and, in fact, increasing the funding for Women's Voice and Leadership, which was announced just recently. Par la suite, nous nous sommes engagés à verser 43 millions de dollars supplémentaires par année pour offrir des programmes durables, flexibles et adaptés aux organisations de défense des droits des femmes dans le monde entier. Le Canada s'est également engagé à jouer un rôle de premier plan dans la promotion de la santé et des droits sexuels et reproductifs des femmes et des adolescents de partout dans le monde. Nous savons que la santé et les droits sexuels et reproductifs sont essentiels à la réalisation de l'égalité des genres et que cette dernière est une condition préalable de l'atteinte des ODD. We cannot achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, unless we are including the health and SRHR for women and girls and non-binary peoples all around the world. C'est pourquoi, en 2019, le Canada a pris l'engagement sur 10 ans d'atteindre un financement moyen de 1,4 milliard de dollars par année d'ici 2023 pour soutenir la santé des femmes, des enfants et des adolescents dans le monde entier. De ce montant, 700 millions de dollars sont consacrés à la santé et aux droits sexuels et reproductifs. So 700 million of the funding that we're putting aside for women's health is going specifically to women's reproductive health and rights. Grâce à cet investissement, le Canada améliore les programmes dans des domaines sous-financés. Les dépenses de l'aide internationale ont augmenté de 20% au cours de la dernière décennie. And I'd like to address that because there have been, and many of you, I think, have also expressed that there's been a decrease in funding for international development in the recent budget. And if you look at the baseline of what we budget every year, it's actually gone up 20% over the last 10 years, and most of that since 2015. And it continues to go up. It's only if you look at that extra pandemic spending. So you look at the billions of dollars that we increased on health around the world. And if you include that as the baseline, then it looks like there was a drop last year. But I can assure you that we are committed to continuing to make sure that we are increasing that baseline every year to 2030. And we are also ensuring that if there are emergencies like pandemics, Canada will be there like we were in the last crisis. This does not mean that there isn't emergency increases that can be funded that aren't necessarily part of the baseline budget. So just to reassure you that it is not a budget cut. And so people who hear this and panic and say, we're going to have to find cuts to programs, that is not the case. We are continuing the funding, and if there are things that need to be funded, we will always have the capacity to be able to increase where needed. So I just wanted, especially for this group, to reassure a little bit about that. C'est pourquoi, en 2019, le Canada a pris l'engagement sur 10 ans d'atteindre un financement moyen de 1,4 milliard de dollars par année d'ici, oh sorry, I lost my place, sorry. Cela signifie accroître à l'accès à des interruptions de grossesse et à des soins après avortement. Cela signifie également promouvoir la santé et les droits sexuels et reproductifs pour les adolescents, notamment l'éducation sexuelle complète. Il s'agit en outre de favoriser la planification familiale et de plaider en faveur de l'avancement de la santé et des droits sexuels et reproductifs, ainsi que de la prévention de la violence sexuelle et fondée sur le genre. We remain, as I said, committed to our feminist international assistance policy. And I know everyone in this room understands the importance of focusing on the empowerment of women. Guided by the feminist international assistance policy, Canada is working to promote sustainable economic growth that works for everyone, increase human dignity through education, health, and humanitarian interventions, foster inclusive governance, take action on climate change, and advance peace and security. And we need to do all of this through a feminist lens. Canada's feminist foreign policy and its inclusive approach to trade are also actively contributing to the advancement of the SDGs. Canada's inclusive approach to trade seeks to ensure that the benefits and opportunities that flow from trade are more widely shared with underrepresented groups such as women, Indigenous peoples, youth, and small and medium enterprises. Inclusive trade supports sustainable economic growth, decent jobs, and helps lift people out of poverty. The 2030 Agenda recognizes that there can be no peace without sustainable development, and no sustainable development without peace. Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security works together with the FIAP and the Feminist Foreign Policy to advance the objectives of SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Inclusive Societies. Evidence shows that gender equality reinforces social cohesion and stable societies. And it shows that the participation of women in peace negotiations leads to more lasting peace. I was in Bosnia. I was working with OSCE there when Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed by the United Nations. And working with the women on the ground in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I saw tangibly how vitally important it was in a real context to make sure that women were included. Because when you look at peace negotiations, and I've often said that the days where a group of warlords get into a room, divide up the spoils of war, and call it a peace agreement, those days are over. And that is exactly what Security Council Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda are all about. And just so you know, in my maiden speech in Parliament in 2015, I mentioned Security Council Resolution 1325. So that is the level of commitment. And in fact, it is the women of the Global South who said to me in the days that I was working in Africa and other countries that said, you know, Canada could be doing more. Why are you here working with us? Why aren't you running? Why aren't you going back home, essentially, and running for office and making sure that Canada's there for us? And that was one of the things that actually motivated me to run for office the first time when I lost in 2011, and then to run again in 2015. And so being here in front of you, being able to talk about this and Canada's ongoing commitment to this is something that I feel like we've done right by some of the women that really inspired and encouraged me to put my name forward on a ballot. So, and this is something we are deeply committed to and will continue to do. The SDG Advocates Group brings together 17 international personalities, musicians, actors, business leaders, and members of the royal family who strive to raise awareness and support for the SDGs. We are honored that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been chosen to co-chair this group alongside the Prime Minister of Barbados, Ms. Motley. Success lies in the accumulation of millions of individual decisions made every day that collectively shape the world. The SDGs offer us a common language. They provide us with a roadmap to ensure an inclusive and resilient recovery from the pandemic. In addition, they guide us in all aspects of our foreign policy and our presence on the international scene. Within Global Affairs Canada, as part of the Sustainable Development Strategy, we're looking at ways to make our presence more sustainable, whether at headquarters or in our more than 300 missions around the world. Our department, the departmental SDG strategy, aims to make our efforts to advance the SDGs more coherent, effective, and impactful. It also aims to strengthen our ability to integrate a sustainable development perspective into our work. Our Aim for the Goals campaign, which I think many of you are probably familiar with, aims to inspire people to care about the SDGs. This includes the annual International Development Week, during which we highlight the contributions of Canadians to eradicating poverty and building a more peaceful, inclusive, and prosperous world. I think many of you are among those Canadians that are contributing to those things. I've already talked about innovative solutions, and we know that innovation is simply about thinking and doing things differently. Taking an intersectional feminist approach, for example. When everyone has a role and a voice, greater innovation is possible. Canada prioritizes putting people at the center of the SDGs. After all, the 2030 Agenda is a people-centered agenda developed through an inclusive process that sought to incorporate perspectives from everyone. For the SDGs to be successful, space for civil society needs to be protected and expanded. And again, in this area, we are seeing where authoritarian influences are starting to pull back on that space for civil society in many countries in the world. And this is something I think that's concerning to all of us. We need to ground our actions in evidence provided to us by data scientists and academics. I think it's very fitting that we're in an academic institution today. We need more and better disaggregated data. We need to support the empowerment of people to engage and to act. And we need the private sector on board, playing a substantive role. A transition to a circular economy could catalyze progress on the SDGs, contributing across all three dimensions: social, economic, and environmental. The private sector is also a key partner in finding innovative solutions to financing the achievement of the SDGs. We all have our roles to play. We also have to work together better. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, we need to start looking at the 2030 Agenda as a change management project. We need to put people at the center, but we also need to support them through the transition needed to achieve the SDGs. There's a mountain of work ahead of us as we build the future that we all want to see. And reaching the summit all depends on a fundamental understanding that it takes all of us working together at all levels of society to make change happen. Canada has all the right people and all the right tools to help chart a path to a more sustainable future. You are all part of that leadership. I want to thank you for your efforts and for your enthusiasm for sustainable development. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day and that you are all energized for the work ahead. And I'd like to thank Carleton University. As was mentioned, many of my staff are actually Carleton graduates, and my husband is a Carleton grad, and my riding is actually also here in Ottawa, and it's just on the other side. So many of my constituents are either professors or students or work here at Carleton University. So I just wanted to add a little bit about how important, how special that relationship is with Carleton University. And I know firsthand the quality of your graduates and their ability to do critical thinking and social awareness. And I think that is something that, we have something to learn from young people. I have seen with the younger generation, those that are in university or just graduating from university, there is an understanding and awareness that we are all interconnected, that what happens on the other side of the globe has a direct impact on our lives and what happens here. And I think that's something that they could teach some of us older people a little bit more about. So it's wonderful to be here at a university campus. It's wonderful to be here with all of the professionals that are here in the room and those that are at similar conferences across the country, because I do think that the level of lived experience of all of the combined knowledge and experience that all of you have, the solutions that we need, and certainly the solutions we need as legislators and as government, they're all here in this room. And I hope very much that we'll be able to learn the lessons from everything that you've been able to contribute. So thank you for inviting me, and good luck with the rest of your day. Thank you.
I don't have a lot of slides, so don't be scared. I only have about 5 or 6, and I have to really cut down on the time that I was given. But I think I just want to provide some high-level, like a high-level overview of where we are and why we are here, and maybe offer very quickly, some final, some reflections for the day as I conclude the presentation. So we've already talked about 23 as the halfway point for implementing the 2030 agenda. The context for this is that we have a high-level political forum coming up in July, so next month, and so this high-level political forum will be about how we continue to accelerate recovery from COVID-19 and the full implementation of the SDGs as we move forward. It will focus on specific SDGs, clean water, clean energy, sustainable cities, and a couple of others. And the other important piece of today's meeting is that Canada will be producing and presenting its second voluntary national review this year. So for those of you who remember, a few years ago, we had the first one, that was in 2018. And if you go back to that document, you will see that there was really no sort of concrete evaluation of what the different goals were. It was more of a roadmap of where we were going, because it was still early days. Only a few years had passed since 2015. So the first VNR really kind of set up the stage or sort of prepared people for what was going to happen in the next few years. So now, 5 years later, Canada will produce this second voluntary national review, and it will focus on SDGs 1, 4, 5, 13, and 17, which you can see on the screen. So it will be specifically focusing on those. And I suspect that Minister Gould later today will be talking about this voluntary national review. I don't know how much she will be able to say, but her ministry has been responsible for leading on that file, so we certainly look forward to what she has to say. One of the things that David mentioned earlier is where Canada is. So now, typically, I don't look at this. I'm a development economist, so I tend to look at what's going on outside of Canada. So I was actually forced to go and look at this ranking, which has been around for a while, which is why when David, when David asked the question, what rank Canada is, well, I knew what it was because I had looked at the data. And so we are currently 29th on this index. You can interpret this index as the percentage achievement on the SDGs. So Canada has achieved, if you want to think about it this way, about 78% of the SDGs. The number one country, anyone? Finland is number one at about 86.5%. What's interesting when you go down the list, so you may look at this and say, well, out of 193 countries, 29 is actually not bad. But what's interesting is when you look at where we are relative to other countries, and I just did a quick calculation based on income levels, right? Because I wanted to know whether countries that were doing better were all richer. And I used, of course, I'm an economist, so I used a very crude metric, which is GDP per capita. It turns out that when you do this exercise, there are a significant number of countries that have lower levels of GDP per capita but are doing better than we are. You can actually go and look at the data. It's available, but you don't have, you need to do the correlation, which is basically what I did. And so it's not just about money in a sense, because there are countries that are not as rich as we are, but are still doing better than we are. And then what's interesting is you can actually go and look at where we are doing well and where we're doing less well. But the bottom line is, if you look at this, and I think previous speakers have mentioned this, we need to do better. I think that's a message that is clear. We've done a lot in the last few years, but we still have a lot of room to do better and to accelerate the progress that will be needed. And in fact, if you look at another index, which is an interesting one because that one provides sort of a mapping of Canada's footprint in the development landscape. Those of you who study international development will know this quite well, and those who teach it have probably used it. There's a Center for Global Development Commitment to Development Index that has been around for quite a while. And in this case, Canada is 9th out of 40 countries. And what you see there is that we do well on certain things, but we don't do as well on others, such as the environment, which is a key aspect of Agenda 2030. In fact, I was interested in where we were for development finance because I focus on foreign aid a lot in my own work. And we're actually 15th. What the report, however, says is that we don't do as well on quantity, but we do better on quality, which is interesting. I'm comforted by the remarks of a former speaker who just mentioned that we're not going to cut down on foreign aid. I think that's reassuring because we need resources. I mean, it's not all about resources, but we need it. And I'll come back to this very briefly. I was going to show you a YouTube video, but I think we can skip it. I'm happy to share the slides after the meeting, and people can watch it. It's basically a summary of what the SDG 2022 report from the UN provided. It's pretty grim. And on the next slide, I basically summarized it in 2 paragraphs. One is that it's fairly grim assessment of where we are. It's not. I think the first 4 or 5, I think most of it is actually negative, which is quite depressing, frankly. After minute 3, I was, okay, I have to stop watching this because nothing seems to be working. But I think, you know, I was going to have a picture of a glass half full on one of my slides. I think probably this is what we should be thinking about. I mean, we've done a lot of good things, but there's still room for improvement. But the assessment is not great. And I think part of the reason for this is that it comes on the back of 3 years of a pandemic, the war in Ukraine, other conflicts that are happening around the world, climate change, of course. So all of this together, when you look at the global picture, does not look good for what to expect in the coming years. So significant threats to the 2030 agenda, which has been completely derailed by the pandemic in a sense, right? For the last 2 or 3 years, we were not really focused on this because of what was going on elsewhere. So final slide, and I just leave this here, I think, for further reflection for the day. I think most reports that I have seen inevitably come to the conclusion that we need better data, we need more data, which is kind of counterintuitive because we do have a lot more data today than we had 15, 20 years ago, but it seems like there's still a lot of gaps in the data that is being collected. And so I think there's a lot of room there. If we want to have good policies, we need better data. I think we need a much more targeted approach. In fact, and I'm going to talk about 2 papers that I had recently worked on. One is with a PhD student, Carla Cisneros, who's going to be here later today. I don't think she's here. There we go. So this is a paper where we actually looked at poverty projections going to 2030. So we basically tried to provide an estimate of where poverty will be over the coming years. And it's pretty obvious when you look at the data. And we're not the first persons to say this. Others have done it. But poverty will become increasingly concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected states, so FCAS. In fact, if you read the SDGs 2022 report, I did a search in the PDF and typed conflict and fragile, hardly mentioned, right? Which is a bit strange because if we want to make a difference to the first goal of zero poverty, this is really where we need to focus our attention on. In fact, in the work that I did with Carla, what we found is that poverty becomes extremely concentrated in a few large countries like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo in particular stand out. So if you don't actually go to these difficult places and try to attack the problem, you're not going to make a big difference to the numbers. There are other countries as well. Of course, when we were writing the paper, Afghanistan happened and Ukraine happened, and so we had to go and revise a lot of the estimates as a result of this, but the big picture doesn't change that much, right? So this is a clear area where I think we need to focus a lot of our attention on. And many donors today dedicate a specific amount of their budget, right? They've decided to focus specific amounts to fragile and conflict-affected states. The second piece of this is a paper that I wrote with a colleague at the University of Ottawa and another student of ours, Bianca Washuta. And what we looked at was all the voluntary national reviews that were produced by fragile and conflict-affected states in the last few years. And we wanted to see whether what they were producing actually confirm what we could see from other data sources. And one of the conclusions that we came up with in that report, in that paper, was that it's not just a question of data and resources, it's also about the elite commitment to reforms. Because if you can't get the political leaders in these countries to commit to this agenda, to reform, you're not going to go very far. So governance, you can call it governance, peace, whatever you want to call it, but you need that commitment from elites, from political elites, in order to move the ball forward. So it's not just a question of throwing money at the problem. You have a big political problem, of course, that you also need to address. The fourth thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, maybe to have people think about this more, is SDG interlinkages. Of course, by design, the SDGs are interdependent and indivisible. So you cannot think of one without thinking of the other. And I think that's something that we often do not think enough about. We have good tools today that are still being developed to look at the impact of taking action in one particular area and what that means for the other goals. So the reason I think we need to pay more attention to this is that, one, we want to have coherent policies because we don't want to undermine what we're doing by only looking at one particular SDG. So we need to know what the consequences are for the others. And then we're also living in a world of more and more constrained resources, so we need to pay more attention to where we should invest our scarce dollars, right? So paying attention to these multiplier effects, I think, is something that we don't do enough. I've put money at the bottom. I think this is something that we just don't have a choice. I mean, we need to spend the money. I'm not going to have a debate now about whether that should come from ODA or elsewhere, but the bottom line is you need the money to do it. And I think you can make a case for ODA for certain countries like fragile and conflict-affected ones, but we need a whole of society, different sectors, the private sector. I was at a meeting yesterday on Canada-Germany relations, and it's incredible how much innovation is taking place in clean tech and clean energy, but all these private companies are actually asking for the government of Canada to subsidize them, because otherwise they can't do it, right? So you need government involvement in these projects to get them going. So we need active government intervention, but we also need the bulk of the resources has to come from the private sector. And a big word that was used time and time again there was de-risking. How do you de-risk these projects so that the private sector will actually engage in it? And then the final thing I would say, and I'll end here, is really the global versus local aspect. I am still surprised at how many times people ask me what this is when they see this pin, which is the SDG pin. I think there's really a disconnect between us in this room and what we know about the SDGs and what the general population out there knows about the SDGs. And I sometimes think that it's also an Ottawa phenomenon, because we're here, so we're close to the government. We all talk about this. We're all development professionals or academics, or we work in this space. But I'm still shocked at how little people know about this halfway into this agenda. So I think because a lot of the action is going to happen at the local level, we really need people to think about the local and how to engage with this. And I think a lot of people already do it without recognizing that they're actually contributing to the 2030 agenda. But there's really, we really need to have a push in terms of a better campaign or whatever to get people to understand why this matters. And I just find that there's a real disconnect between what we see at the global level and in meetings like this, and then once you go out there and people see this, they say, what is this? I've never actually seen it. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So I will stop here and yield the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Generally, the SDGs, I think are, the more I look back on how they came about, they are an extraordinary, radical goal that the global community has set itself, compared to anything else that we've got out there in terms of its humanitarian vision and the fact that it's a very inclusive process that holds wealthy countries and poorer countries, developing countries, all in the same framework, and recognizes that we're all in the same boat trying to achieve a common vision of what it is to be a thriving community on a sustainable planet. And that, for that to have come out of the kind of bureaucratic processes that the world has given itself, is pretty remarkable. And hopefully, as we move into this second half, that will be increasingly recognized and increasingly a source of motivation. And it will also, I think, hopefully allow us to go into thinking about what happens beyond 2030 and what the next set of goals are going to be. We'll do that in a position of optimism, which is hard to conjure up sometimes at this particular moment in time, particularly as you peer out into the smoke out of the window. But it is, I think, very striking that this set of goals was the process of a much more inclusive process that brought in civil society, the private sector, as well as government people, compared to the Millennium Development Goals. And I think we're moving into a period where it's increasingly recognized that the only way we're going to make progress on delivering those goals and is to really bring in everybody, to bring it's only the people on the ground, the women in the villages, as the previous speaker said, being engaged in this process, the average Canadian citizen understanding what that badge is about and buying into it, that's going to get us there. And so that how to make that happen has got to be fundamentally at the core of the agenda for the next few years and beyond. So one of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they weren't designed with measurability in mind. In fact, only, I think, of the 169 targets, I think less than a fifth are either directly or indirectly measurable. And so, and in fact, the SDGs, for very good reasons, but not good reasons from a data gathering perspective, are not a consistent set of things. So we have a process like partnerships alongside sort of goals around poverty reduction that are very clearly numerically based targets. And so even when we see a ranking that puts Canada 29th, that is a ranking of sort of bundling a whole load of apples and oranges together and trying to sort of take a common judgment. The Social Progress Index, which I was one of the co-founders of, as I said, and where we have academics like, it's very much sort of drawing on Amartya Sen's work, but also economists like Michael Porter was the chair of the advisory board. This was done before the SDGs and was an attempt to find a way of measuring, a universal way of measuring the progress of a society using non-financial outcome measures that were comparable across countries. So we have basically identified 12 components, which we ranked into 3 pillars that all are trying to answer questions like, do people have enough food to eat? And are they receiving basic medical care? Are people safe? Do they have adequate housing with basic utilities? Through to through to things like opportunity. Are you free to marry who you want? Are your rights as an individual really protected? Do you have access to advanced education? And to find, as I say, globally consistent measures of how those outcomes are being delivered. We think it highly aligns to the basic ideals and that are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, but is arguably a much more accurate measure of progress in those areas because it is designed with measurability to the forefront. But you will see all 17 of the goals are touched on to some extent, and we would say it has a 95% fit with the aspirations of the SDGs, subject to the limitations of this mixture of process and outcomes that the SDGs is. So we also, I would say, globally, we found that since 2011, when we first published this data, there has been significant social progress around the world. And in the first period through to 2017, there was a significant, again, we're using the 0 to 100 score, so 3.45 points improvement globally on average in social progress up to 2017. Progress since then has been much slower globally. And actually, in our most recent work, we are unfortunately predicting that there will be the world's first global social progress recession when the next set of data is revealed. I would also, as an aside, I would say even with our data centricity approach, we're still recognizing that in a number of areas it's very hard to get a very good fit on a globally consistent basis. And when we've done local indexes, we're able to get much more, I think, granular evidence of progress. And we just last week rolled out a whole social progress index across the United States that goes down to each electoral ward in the country and allows them to have their own social progress index number, which I'm hoping will generate an enormous amount of conversation about what policies work and what doesn't. It's also used by the European Commission in terms of doing local support grants and by the government of India to track progress at a state and city level. And we're hoping that it will roll out at a more granular local level around the world over the next few years. So on average, if you want to look at the individual components, you can see where the world has been going forward, most, big improvements on water and sanitation, on shelter, on nutrition and basic medical care, but actually, and access to information and communications as well, access to advanced education. But there has been really significant decline over the last 10 years in personal rights and pretty much stagnation on things that represent inclusiveness globally. And we think that's where, if it does go into a social progress recession, those will be the factors that really drive that. And a lot of the data that we've had is all pre the worst impacts of COVID. So particularly on education, we would expect to see that also dragging the numbers back over the next year or two because of so many people being out of school, particularly girls. As for Canada, generally one of the top performers on social progress, up there with the Scandinavians and New Zealand and so forth in all these indices. But there is quite a nuanced picture, and I mean, interestingly, to see the moving backwards on shelter, which may reflect some of the other concerns about the housing market that we pick up in Canada, but there may be other things going on there, is striking, as is the movement backwards on personal freedom and choice. So that's one way of looking at Canada. The other is we have a dashboard where we are basically putting Canada against a group of countries with similar per capita GDP and seeing where Canada performs. And generally, I mean, that's a pretty challenging peer group, although there is Saudi Arabia in there as well, which presumably improves the human rights relativities on this. But you're up there, you're in there with New Zealand and Germany and other places, countries like that. But basically, Canada is behind on a number of areas relative to its peers, but ahead on environmental quality, on lead exposure in particular, and one or two other areas. So this dashboard, I think, is quite a useful way of doing peer group measuring. What it, I think, leaves on the overall message is that the Social Progress Index data does confirm much of what we've heard already. There are a lot of challenges. We're a long way off. I mean, I think on our basic measure before we factor in the COVID impact was that the world was about 50 years off target on getting the SDGs by 2030. It's got to be worse than that now, I would say. So we are facing an immense challenge, and I think a lot of what we need to do, both internationally and domestically, is to reignite a sense of momentum, at least in the right direction over this second half. It's improbable that we're going to get anywhere close to most of those SDGs by 2030, and we're going to be into this process of defining what's the next set, and that needs to be, I think, done from a position of at least showing positive momentum and some basis for optimism as we go forward. So that's the Social Progress Index. Happy to talk to anyone about that because I do think Canada would, having a more localized version of it in Canada would be a great plus, but also, I'd love to understand the findings that we're getting there a bit better. Secondly, 17 rooms. So for a while, I was at Rockefeller Foundation after I left The Economist, running the Bellagio Center, and one of the, which is a sort of think tank retreat place that the foundation has. And we had a session on the future of global development and how to accelerate it. And John MacArthur, who is a great Canadian, I'm sure many of you know, at Brookings, he and I, and Margaret Biggs, as another well-known Canadian economist, came up with this idea between us of the 17 rooms, which is that we would have a conference in New York in the Rockefeller Foundation headquarters, and each room would have a group of experts in that would focus on a specific SDG with an attempt to basically ground it in something a little more that you could really get hold of. because there's a sense that the 17 goals, 169 targets can be incredibly overwhelming, and also it's in the distance of 2030. And so the question we put to each room was, your group of experts on this goal, what would be the most useful things the world could do over the next 12 to 18 months to really move things forward on that particular goal? And after they'd done all their brainstorming, we then mixed all the rooms up and had them brief each other, and with a specific question of what are the synergies between what your goal has been focusing on and what the other goals are, and see if we could find 2 or 3 each year cross-cutting themes that could be a global set of priorities for the next 12 to 18 months. And we found this to be an extremely effective approach that actually became more effective during COVID, because whereas you get a certain type of person is able to be in New York in September for an in-person meeting, we were able to use the fact we were all forced to be remote to bring a lot more people into the conversation who were really a lot of people on the front line of some of the most difficult challenges that we face. And so that 17 rooms thing has become a real platform now. We're now having a number of universities have had their own 17 rooms days where they brought their faculty together with their students to really look at what can be done practically in that community around. We've had cities that have done it. We've had some business associations and companies looking at how they can do a 17 rooms, which we sort of lightly branded 17 rooms X, in the sort of copying from TED and TEDx, this sort of notion that let's get down into local communities. And the goal really is, in any 17 rooms gathering, to ask the question, what can we do locally over the next 12 to 18 months with this community to really make a difference on the goals? And our hope is that we can really see that catch on as an idea in the second half of this race to 2030 as a way of spreading and engaging many more people in the SDG process. Today, we're going to go into these breakout groups that we have 4 of them, and it won't be a full SDG process, so it's a full 17 rooms process, but it will be in the spirit of 17 rooms, which is to really ask the question, given the topic we're looking at, and they're each of them is cross-cutting more than a single SDG. But what are the things that we most need to focus on, particularly over the next 12 to 18 months, to really move things forward, both domestically in Canada and internationally, in terms of the contribution that this group and Canada as a country can make to delivering globally what needs to be done. And I think the world does still look to Canada for as a leader, both in terms of the international development agenda, but also domestically in taking on some of the zeitgeist issues that have to be addressed if the world is to move forward to this much more inclusive view of human thriving and planetary thriving that we need to have. So the questions we're going to ask you are really focused on those priorities, identifying those priorities so that we can go back and report back into the national process that's going on here, and hopefully beyond that into the global review process that's taking place, some real practical steps that can be taken. My task with Volupti and others is going to be to come back with some closing recommendations that reflect everything that has been deliberated in the groups during the rest of the day, and I'll feed those back in my closing remarks right at the end of the day. I think this is what why you've invited me to bring my journalist hat, really, to listen and to sort of pick out key trends. We have 4 of working groups. I think most of you will have been pre-assigned or pre-opted into one of those groups. So there's decolonizing the SDGs. I do think it's striking that even compared to 2015, when the SDGs were begun, just how much there is a recognition that we can't just have a top-down sort of rich country worldview being imposed on everybody else, but that this needs to be an incredibly, not just inclusive, but really a bottom-up, owned by the people who are going to live that future vision, and will have more insight into how to deliver it than anyone else. So the decolonizing, how we get away from that old way of vision of change to something that's much more owned by those that really need to be owning it. That group will look at those questions. The second is the future of climate justice. And I think we're going to see with the G20 in India just how big a divide is now emerging between the global south and the rich G7 countries, about how do we really, how can these rich countries be sitting there asking developing countries to give up what we take for granted ourselves in terms of our lifestyles, in order to basically tackle the environmental disaster that we in the rich world have created. And I think already the international community's, the rich world's failure on COVID, honouring its pledges on COVID, plus its failure at the various COP meetings so far to really put its money where it needs to be, is causing a real threat to the SDG process and to the global system. And so that's how do we address that with climate, the just transition on climate, I think being the question of all that frames what the challenges that we have to get this right globally, better than anything else. The third topic is, and we've heard a lot about Canada's feminist foreign policy already today, but what does that really mean for the SDGs? I think the SDGs were written before anyone talked about feminist foreign policy, but they certainly did have a very clear understanding that women and girls had to be at the most visible group that were benefiting from this if we were to be serious about generally delivering on the SDGs. But what really does that feminist turn mean now? What are the next 18 months of advancing that part of the agenda, which is key to the success of the whole agenda? What's that going to be about? And finally, at the heart of the SDGs was this notion that no one must be left behind, that this was an inclusive agenda, and the danger of looking at average progress on the SDGs is that we do miss out actually some of the most vulnerable groups, maybe in the most fragile countries as well. But that working group, we're really focusing on, okay, who's being left out now that we need to really focus on hard over the next 12 to 18 months to get them not being left behind, but really maybe the people we focus on most if we're going to get this SDG agenda back on track. So I'm going to finish my remarks there. I'm just looking forward to the conversation. I have enormous respect for all of you and the expertise you bring. And yes, sorry, we have a hand up there.
Yeah, just a question about the social progress index. To what extent is it related to Canada's progress in Canada, right? Looking at affordable housing, water and electricity, versus Canada, meaning Canadian government, Canadian organizations, Canadian private sector, in improving the achievement of social development goals in developing countries.
So the Social Progress Index is entirely inward focused on your own performance for you as a community or country, in delivering a better life for your people. So that it's entirely directed that way. So the earlier numbers I showed for the global SPI scores, that is the aggregation of every country's own efforts to improve, which obviously will be affected by international support in some situations, but not in others. But it's really a self-contained, here's my country or here's my city, this is how it's doing on these objective data-based, sort of outcome measures of progress.
And the percent that Dr. Sammy put up before, 78, was that on this social?
No, I think that reflects, the data that the Sustainable Development Network has collected, which is really trying to be very faithful to the every sort of detail of the 169 targets that are the sub-targets of the 17 goals, but which I think are somewhat is a heroic process, because the SDGs are really not designed with a statistician who's thinking about how you measure these things. And unfortunately, a combination of the way the targets and goals are worded rather than the spirit of them, plus the fact that data has been terribly underinvested in many parts of the world and in all sorts of areas that should have been much better measured. Even in the richest countries, they've been under-investing in all sorts of important data. Has left a real problem. And so what we were doing with Social Progress Index was really starting with what can we, what's the best data that we can get across 160 countries that would most fit the particular outcome that we think people are desiring. But in some cases, I would say even our data is, not a very, very good fit to what we'd like to get. And I think that is one of the huge challenges. It ought to be a huge opportunity given all the new data that's being produced, but in the private sector. But still, if we could actually measure things much better, I think we'd be doing much better on the SDGs. But